My husband insisted we use a surrogate instead of adopting. When I learned why, I discovered he'd been planning this for years, and she was already pregnant. My husband Derek threw the adoption brochures in the trash while I stood in our kitchen holding a coffee mug that suddenly felt too heavy. We'd been trying to have a baby for 6 years. 3 rounds of IVF had failed. My eggs were viable, but my uterus had scarring from a surgery gone wrong when I was 23. The doctors said carrying to term would be nearly impossible. I'd suggested adoption 6 months ago, and Derek had been stalling ever since. Now he was telling me he'd found a better solution: a surrogate. He said he'd already been researching agencies and had found the perfect candidate: a woman named Sloan who was 28, healthy, and had successfully carried 2 pregnancies before. He showed me her profile on his phone with this intensity in his eyes I'd never seen. She had auburn hair and green eyes and a smile that seemed too familiar. I asked where he found her, and Derek said through a friend who'd used a surrogate last year. He said Sloan was available immediately and willing to start the process within weeks. I asked why he hadn't discussed this with me before researching so extensively. Derek said he wanted to have options ready because adoption could take years, and he knew I was devastated after the 3rd IVF failure. He said surrogacy would let us have a biological child, that we could use my eggs and his sperm and have the family we'd always dreamed of. But something in his voice felt rehearsed. The way he emphasized biological child made my stomach turn. I told him I needed time to think about it. Surrogacy felt more invasive than adoption, more complicated legally and emotionally. I'd have to watch another woman carry our child while my body remained broken. Derek's face hardened when I hesitated. He said I was being irrational and that if I really wanted a baby, I should be grateful he'd found a solution. He said adoption meant raising someone else's child with unknown genetic backgrounds and potential problems. He said with surrogacy, we'd know exactly what we were getting. The conversation ended with me feeling guilty for not immediately embracing his plan. The next morning, I found paperwork on his desk, a surrogacy contract already drafted with Sloan's name on it. The contract was dated 3 months earlier, 3 months before he'd supposedly started researching. I stood in his office staring at the document, my hands shaking. The contract outlined payment terms, medical protocols, and custody arrangements. Everything was detailed and professional, but the date at the top made no sense. Derek had told me yesterday he'd only recently found Sloan through a friend's recommendation. This contract proved he'd been working with her for months. I photographed every page with my phone, some instinct telling me I'd need evidence later. When Derek came home from work that evening, I was waiting in his office. I held up the contract and asked him to explain the date. His face went through several expressions before settling on defensive irritation. Derek said his friend had given him the template and he'd been slowly customizing it to save time once I agreed. I asked why Sloan's name was already filled in if he'd only recently found her profile. Derek finally met my eyes and said she was the only surrogate his friend recommended, so he'd started the paperwork assuming I'd agree. He said I was making this difficult for no reason. The way he said it made me feel small and unreasonable. He'd always been good at that, making me question my own perceptions. I asked to meet Sloan before we proceeded. Derek said that wasn't necessary until we signed contracts, but I insisted. He finally agreed to arrange a meeting for the following week. He said I'd feel better once I met her and understood how perfect she was for us. Something about the word perfect made my skin crawl. I spent those days researching surrogacy laws and scrolling through the agency website Derek had shown me. Sloan's profile was professional and detailed, but something about it felt wrong. The timeline of her previous surrogacies didn't quite align with the dates listed. One pregnancy supposedly overlapped with another by 2 months. I called the agency asking general questions about their vetting process. The woman who answered had a script she read from about background checks and medical screenings. When I mentioned Sloan's name specifically, there was a pause. She said she'd need to call me back. I asked why, and she said she needed to pull Sloan's file to give me accurate information. I said I'd wait, but she insisted on calling back within the hour. The call never came. When I tried again the next day, the number went to a generic voicemail. I tried several more times over the following days. No one ever answered. I searched for the agency name online and found almost nothing beyond a basic website that looked recently created. No reviews, no news articles, no social media presence. The website had stock photos of babies and smiling couples, but no actual testimonials or case studies. I took screenshots of everything. I showed Derek that evening, and he said surrogacy agencies were often low profile due to privacy concerns. He said I was looking for problems where none existed. He said my anxiety about having children was making me paranoid. The meeting with Sloan was scheduled for Saturday at a coffee shop downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car watching the entrance. Derek's car pulled up at exactly 3 p.m., and I was about to get out when I saw Sloan was already inside at a corner table visible through the window. Derek walked in and they hugged. Not the polite greeting of new acquaintances, but the comfortable embrace of people who knew each other well. Derek's hand lingered on her lower back as they separated. They sat and talked for 5 minutes before Derek checked his phone. He saw my text saying I was parking, and his entire demeanor changed, becoming more formal. He sat up straighter. Sloan stopped smiling. They both arranged their faces into professional expressions. When I walked in and approached their table, Sloan stood and extended her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Derek kissed my cheek and said he'd just been telling Sloan how excited we were. But I'd seen them before I entered. They hadn't been talking about us at all. We talked for an hour about logistics and expectations. Sloan said she'd always wanted to help couples who couldn't conceive naturally. She said pregnancy was easy for her and she believed in giving the gift of parenthood to those who desperately wanted children. She used phrases that sounded rehearsed, probably from a script on surrogacy websites. But she kept looking at Derek when she spoke, not at me. I asked about her previous surrogacies and she gave vague answers about the families preferring privacy. She said both families had been wonderful to work with and she'd remained friends with them. I asked if we could contact them for references and Sloan's smile tightened. She said the contracts included strict confidentiality clauses that prevented her from sharing their information. Derek jumped in saying that was standard industry practice. I asked Sloan why she wanted to be a surrogate specifically for us. She said Derek had spoken so passionately about wanting a family that she'd been moved by his story. She said she could tell we'd be wonderful parents. I asked when Derek had told her our story. Sloan's face went blank for a second before Derek said they'd spoken on the phone during the initial consultation. But he told me we hadn't spoken to her yet, that we were meeting her for the first time today. I pointed this out and Derek said he meant initial research consultation through the agency. He said he'd explained our situation when requesting surrogate profiles. The lies were piling up and neither of them seemed concerned about keeping them straight. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from their performance. In the bathroom, I called the number Derek had shown me for the agency. It went straight to voicemail again. I tried searching for Sloan's full name from the contract I'd photographed. Sloan Whitmore. I found her on social media immediately. Her profile was private, but her profile picture showed her with auburn hair at a beach. I could see she had several hundred friends. Tagged photos went back years. I scrolled through what was public and found a photo from 5 years ago at what looked like a corporate event. Derek was in the background talking to someone. They were at the same event. I screenshot it and returned to the table. My hands were shaking as I sat down. I asked Sloan if she'd ever met Derek before this surrogacy arrangement. She said no without hesitation. I asked Derek the same question. He said no. Why would I ask that? I showed them the photo on my phone. Derek's face went completely white. The blood drained from it so fast I thought he might pass out. Sloan looked at him, and then at me, and said that must have been a coincidence, maybe the same conference center. Her voice was less confident now. I asked what conference. Neither answered. Derek was staring at the photo, and Sloan was staring at Derek. I asked again what conference this was. Derek finally said it was a tech industry conference from years ago. He said thousands of people attended, so it didn't mean anything. I asked why he'd lied about knowing her if it was so meaningless. He said he hadn't lied, he'd just forgotten about a random conference from 5 years ago. But the way Sloan was looking at him suggested she hadn't forgotten at all. I stood up and said I needed to leave. Derek grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and said I was overreacting to a meaningless coincidence. I pulled away and told him not to touch me. The other customers in the coffee shop were starting to stare. I walked out and Derek followed me to the parking lot calling my name. People on the sidewalk turned to watch. I got in my car and locked the doors. He stood outside my window saying Sloan was just someone he'd worked with years ago and he'd forgotten about the conference. He said it didn't matter because she was still a qualified surrogate. I asked why he'd lied about knowing her. Derek said he didn't want me to feel weird about using someone he'd worked with briefly. He said I was sabotaging our only chance at having a baby. I asked what else he was lying about. He didn't answer, just stood there looking desperate and angry. I drove home and Derek stayed out for hours. When he finally came back around 10 p.m., he went straight to his office and closed the door. I could hear him on the phone speaking in low, urgent tones. I pressed my ear to the door and heard him say they needed to stick to the story. He said I was getting suspicious and they had to be careful. He said he'd handle it, but she needed to back him up. I recorded the conversation on my phone. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. Her name was Veronica, and she specialized in infidelity and background checks. I told her everything and showed her the photos, the contract, and the recording. She said she'd look into Sloan's background and Derek's connection to her. She said it would take a week to compile a comprehensive report. I paid her retainer with money from an account Derek didn't know about, my grandmother's inheritance that I'd kept separate. 3 days later, Veronica called with preliminary information that made my stomach drop. Sloan and Derek had worked together 6 years ago at TechCore Solutions. They'd been assigned to the same project team for 8 months developing a new software platform. Coworkers Veronica had tracked down remembered them being very close, possibly having an affair, though nothing was confirmed publicly. Derek had left that job abruptly in March of that year and moved to a different company where he'd met me a month later. Veronica said there was more, but she needed a few more days to verify. I asked what more, and she said she'd found something about Sloan's personal life that seemed relevant. She'd call back when she had confirmation. Those next few days were torture. Derek kept trying to reschedule the surrogacy consultation. He said we needed to move forward with contracts before Sloan took another opportunity. He was pressuring me constantly. I stalled, saying I needed more time to think. Derek's frustration was visible. He stopped trying to hide it. He said I was being selfish and that every day we wasted was another day we weren't parents. He said at this rate we'd never have children and it would be my fault. The guilt he was trying to induce was heavy, but I'd learned to recognize his manipulation tactics over the years. I just never had proof of how deep they went. Veronica called back on a Thursday evening while Derek was working late. She said she'd confirmed that Sloan had been pregnant 6 years ago. Hospital records showed she'd given birth to a daughter in November of that year. The father wasn't listed on the birth certificate, but the timing aligned perfectly with when Derek and Sloan had worked together. Sloan had never married. She'd raised the child alone. Veronica said she'd found more recent information too. Sloan was currently pregnant, approximately 6 months along. I asked if Veronica could find out if Derek was the father of Sloan's daughter. She said that would require DNA evidence, which would be difficult to obtain legally. She said we could try to get court orders during divorce proceedings if I decided to go that route. I asked about the current pregnancy. Veronica said Sloan had been pregnant before Derek had supposedly found her as a surrogate candidate. The timeline didn't match his story. If she'd gotten pregnant 6 months ago and was now 6 months along, that meant Derek had known about the pregnancy before he'd ever mentioned surrogacy to me. Veronica said she'd found something else in Derek's financial records. He'd been making monthly payments to Sloan for the past 5 years. The payments varied from $500 to $2,000 and were labeled as consulting fees. But Sloan wasn't a consultant. She was a graphic designer who worked freelance. Derek had been sending her money regularly for years. The total was over $70,000. I sat in my car in our driveway absorbing this information. Derek had a secret child with Sloan. He'd been paying her for years, probably child support disguised as consulting fees to hide it from me. Now Sloan was pregnant again, and Derek was trying to pass this baby off as our surrogate baby. The elaborate fraud was stunning in its cruelty. I'd been trying to have a baby for 6 years while Derek already had one child and was helping create another. He'd watched me go through painful IVF procedures, hormone treatments, the emotional devastation of failures, all while living this secret life with Sloan. I wanted to scream. Instead, I called Veronica back and asked her to get me everything. Every financial record, every photo, every piece of evidence. I told her I was filing for divorce and I needed ammunition. She said she'd have a complete report by Monday. I asked her to investigate the surrogacy agency too. She said she'd already started and it looked fake. The website was registered to a Gmail address and had only been active for 4 months. That evening, Derek came home with flowers and apologies for pressuring me about the surrogacy. He said he'd been stressed about work and had taken it out on me. He said we could take more time to decide. He cooked dinner and poured wine and acted like the attentive husband he'd been when we first met. I played along because I didn't know what else to do. I needed time to process what I'd learned. I needed to plan my next steps carefully. Derek said he'd talked to Sloan and she understood we needed space. He said she was willing to wait for our decision. I asked how long she could wait. Derek said a few weeks at most because she had other interested families. The lie was so smooth. Sloan wasn't available for other families. She was 6 months pregnant with what was probably Derek's baby. I went to bed early claiming a headache. Derek stayed up late in his office again. I could hear him typing and occasionally talking on the phone in hushed tones. Veronica's full report arrived on Monday via encrypted email. It was 70 pages of documented evidence. Photos of Derek and Sloan together over the past 6 years at various locations. Financial records showing all the payments. Hospital records from Sloan's previous pregnancy. Screenshots of text messages between Derek and Sloan that Veronica had obtained through methods I didn't ask about. The messages were damning. They referred to their daughter by name, Aubrey. Derek talked about missing her first steps and regretting not being more involved. Sloan complained about raising Aubrey alone while Derek built a life with me. Derek promised he'd figure out a way to be a real father someday. The messages from recent months showed them discussing the pregnancy and the surrogacy plan. Sloan said she was scared Derek would abandon this baby too. Derek said this time would be different because I would raise the baby and he could be openly involved as the father. Sloan asked if that was fair to me. Derek said I'd never know the difference. I read every page twice. The cruelty was methodical. Derek hadn't just had an affair and a secret child. He'd maintained a relationship with Sloan for 6 years while married to me. He'd watched his daughter grow up from a distance. When Sloan had gotten pregnant again, either by accident or design, Derek had created this elaborate scheme to make me raise his second affair child. He was going to use my infertility and desperation for a baby to trick me into mothering his children with another woman. The scheme required me to believe I was pursuing surrogacy with my own eggs when Sloan was already pregnant. We'd skip the actual IVF and embryo implantation. Derek would claim we'd done those procedures at a special clinic. Then months later, Sloan would deliver the baby that was supposedly ours. I'd raise Derek's biological child with Sloan, never knowing the truth. He'd have access to both his children. Sloan would be financially secure from the surrogacy payments. Everyone would get what they wanted except me. I called my attorney. Her name was Margaret, and she specialized in high-conflict divorce. I sent her Veronica's entire report. She reviewed it over 2 hours while I sat in her office drinking terrible coffee. When she finished, Margaret looked at me and said this was one of the most elaborate fraud cases she'd seen in 20 years of practice. She said we had grounds for divorce based on infidelity and fraud. She said we could request DNA testing for Sloan's daughter during the proceedings. She said if we could prove Derek was the father, it would strengthen our case for asset division and demonstrate his pattern of deception. She said the fake surrogacy agency was potentially criminal fraud. She asked if I wanted to involve law enforcement. I said yes. Margaret called a detective she'd worked with on previous cases. Detective Ryan Kowalski arrived an hour later and reviewed everything. He said the fake agency website and fraudulent contracts could be prosecuted, but it would be difficult to prove intent without more evidence of me actually being defrauded. He said the stronger case would be civil fraud during divorce. Margaret filed for divorce the next morning. Derek was served with papers at his office. He called me immediately, furious. He said I was overreacting and destroying our marriage over nothing. I told him I knew about Aubrey. The line went silent. Then Derek started talking fast. He said Aubrey was a mistake from before we met. He said he'd been supporting her financially but had no relationship with her. He said it had nothing to do with us. I told him I knew about the current pregnancy. Another silence. Then Derek said Sloan had gotten pregnant accidentally and had approached him about surrogacy. He said he'd only been trying to help both of us. I told him I knew the pregnancy happened before he'd mentioned surrogacy to me. I said I knew about the fake agency and the plan to pass off Sloan's baby as mine. Derek's voice changed, becoming cold and calculated. He said I couldn't prove any of that. He said I was making assumptions based on circumstantial evidence. I told him I had his text messages with Sloan. He hung up. Derek came home an hour later while I was packing. He found me in the bedroom pulling clothes from the closet. He tried to grab my suitcase and I stepped back. He said we needed to talk about this rationally. I asked if he was Aubrey's father. Derek said that wasn't relevant to our marriage. I asked if the current baby was his. Derek said that wasn't relevant either. I asked how long he'd been planning this fraud. Derek finally stopped pretending. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to be a father to his children without losing me. He said the surrogacy plan solved everything. I asked how it solved anything except his problems. Derek said I'd get the baby I wanted. I said I wanted my own baby, not his affair baby. He said genetically it wouldn't matter because we'd raise it together. The sociopathic logic was breathtaking. He'd convinced himself that tricking me into raising his affair children was somehow generous because it gave me motherhood. I told Derek to leave. He refused, saying we needed to work this out. I called Margaret and she called the police. An officer arrived and explained that this was a domestic situation requiring one party to leave temporarily. Derek argued but eventually grabbed some clothes and left. I changed the locks that night and installed a security system the next morning. Margaret filed emergency motions requesting Derek stay away from the house. She also filed motions requesting DNA testing for both of Sloan's children and a full forensic accounting of Derek's finances. The judge granted the restraining order but said DNA testing would require Sloan's cooperation or a compelling legal reason. Margaret argued that Derek's paternity was relevant to asset division and child support obligations. The judge said he'd rule on the DNA motion after reviewing more information. Derek's attorney filed counter motions claiming I was engaging in a vindictive campaign to destroy his reputation. He claimed the divorce was based on misunderstandings and that I was mentally unstable. The scandal exploded within our social circle. Friends took sides. Derek's family called me, constantly demanding to know what was happening. His mother said I was destroying her son's life over mistakes that happened before I'd even met him. I told her Derek had been seeing Sloan throughout our marriage. She said I was lying. I sent her selected text messages between Derek and Sloan discussing Aubrey. She stopped calling. My family was supportive but shocked. My mother kept saying she'd never trusted Derek completely, but hadn't wanted to interfere. My sister offered to let me stay with her, but I wanted to stay in my house. I'd worked to afford this house. Derek could find somewhere else to live. Sloan's attorney contacted Margaret saying Sloan was willing to cooperate with DNA testing. Margaret was surprised. We'd expected Sloan to fight it, but apparently Sloan was angry at Derek now too. She'd thought Derek was going to leave me and be with her after the surrogacy fraud succeeded. She'd thought they'd raise both children together. Derek had apparently never intended that. He'd wanted to stay married to me and keep Sloan as his secret family. The DNA tests were ordered by the court. Derek fought it until the end, but the judge ruled that paternity was relevant to financial obligations. Sloan brought her daughter Aubrey to the testing facility. I wasn't there, but Margaret got the report. Aubrey was a beautiful little girl with auburn hair and Derek's eyes. She was 4 years old, and according to the court-ordered psychologist who'd interviewed her, she knew Derek as Daddy's friend who visits sometimes. Derek had been seeing his daughter sporadically for years, enough to confuse her about his role but not enough to be an actual father. The results came back 3 weeks later. Derek was the biological father of Aubrey with 99.99% certainty. Sloan was 8 months pregnant by then. She agreed to amniocentesis to test paternity of the current baby. Those results took another 2 weeks. Derek was also the father of the baby Sloan was carrying with 99.99% certainty. The evidence was irrefutable. Derek had 2 biological children with Sloan, one that he'd abandoned and one that he'd tried to trick me into raising. The divorce proceedings became a media spectacle. Someone leaked the story to a local news blog. The headline was, "Tech Executives' Elaborate Surrogacy Fraud Exposed." The story outlined Derek's plan to pass off his affair baby as a surrogacy baby. It included quotes from court documents and described the fake agency website. Derek's company put him on administrative leave pending investigation. His reputation in the industry was destroyed overnight. Former colleagues came forward saying Derek had always been manipulative and willing to cut corners. Professional associations asked him to resign. His career imploded within weeks. Sloan also faced public backlash. She'd participated in the fraud willingly. She'd helped create the fake agency website and had been prepared to lie to me throughout the pregnancy. She claimed she'd done it because she loved Derek and wanted their family together. But her complicity was clear. She faced potential criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. Her attorney negotiated a deal where she'd cooperate fully in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Sloane's testimony was devastating. She described meeting Derek 6 years ago and falling in love. She said they'd had a passionate affair that lasted months. When she'd gotten pregnant, Derek had panicked. He said he wasn't ready for children and that his career was just taking off. He'd broken up with her and left the company. When Aubrey was born, Derek had agreed to send money if Sloane kept quiet about his paternity. He'd visited occasionally, but always in secret. He'd told Sloane he'd leave his wife eventually, but the timing had never been right. When Sloane had gotten pregnant again last year, she'd told Derek immediately. He'd been angry at first, saying she'd trapped him again. But then he'd come up with the surrogacy plan. He'd said it was brilliant. He could be a father without admitting his affairs. Sloane would get money and stability. I'd get the baby I desperately wanted. Everyone would win except no one would know the truth except them. Sloane said she'd created the fake agency website using a template. Derek had dictated what information to include. They'd practiced their stories for when they'd meet me. Derek had coached her on what to say and how to act. He'd told her to keep her distance emotionally so I wouldn't get suspicious. The entire thing had been choreographed. Sloane said she'd had doubts throughout. She'd asked Derek multiple times if they should just tell me the truth. Derek had said absolutely not. He'd said I was already broken from infertility and this would destroy me completely. He'd said the kinder thing was to let me believe I was getting my own baby. Sloane said she'd convinced herself Derek was right, that she was helping me by giving me a child to love. She said she understood now how wrong it had been. She said she was sorry. Her apology felt hollow. She'd been willing to deceive me until Derek's plan fell apart. She'd only turned on him when she'd realized he'd never intended to choose her over me. The financial forensics revealed more lies. Derek had paid Sloane over $90,000 during our marriage. The money had come from our joint accounts, bonuses, tax returns. Money I'd thought was going to savings or investments had been transferred to Sloane in small amounts to avoid detection. Derek had been systematically stealing from our marital assets to support his secret family. The judge was furious. She said she'd rarely seen such calculated deception. Derek was ordered to repay the $90,000 plus interest. He was ordered to pay child support for both of Sloane's children based on his income. He was required to pay all of my attorney fees, which had reached nearly $50,000. He lost claim to our house because it had been purchased with money he'd stolen from. I was awarded the house, most of our investments, and a significant cash settlement. Derek's attorney argued he couldn't afford all these obligations. The judge said he should have considered that before committing fraud. Sloane gave birth to a boy she named Evan. Derek was listed as the father on the birth certificate. His parents sued for grandparent visitation rights for both children. Derek's mother said her grandchildren deserved to know their family. She claimed I'd poisoned the court against Derek and that he was a good father who'd made mistakes. Margaret argued that Derek had abandoned one child and had tried to commit fraud regarding the other. The judge ordered supervised visitation for Derek with both children, but gave his parents limited grandparent rights. Sloane's relationship with Derek deteriorated rapidly once I was out of the picture. Without me as the common target of their scheme, they turned on each other. Sloane sued Derek for full custody, claiming he was an unfit father. Derek countersued, claiming Sloane had manipulated him into the fraud scheme. He said she'd gotten pregnant on purpose both times to trap him. Sloane said Derek had promised to leave me and marry her. Derek said he'd never made such promises. They destroyed each other in court while their children grew up in chaos. I sold our house a year after the divorce finalized. It held too many memories of Derek's lies. I moved across the country to Portland where my sister lived. I needed distance from everything that had happened. I needed to rebuild my life without the weight of Derek's deception crushing me. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma from betrayal. Her name was Dr. Monica Chen, and she was patient while I processed years of manipulation. She helped me understand that Derek had targeted my vulnerability systematically. He'd known my deepest pain about infertility and had weaponized it. He'd used my grief as a tool to control me. She said predators often choose victims who are already wounded because they're easier to manipulate. She said Derek's ability to maintain the fraud for so long demonstrated sociopathic tendencies. Normal people couldn't deceive loved ones so thoroughly without guilt. Derek had felt no guilt at all. He'd only felt sorry when he'd gotten caught. Therapy was brutal and necessary. I had to examine how I'd missed signs of Derek's deception. There had been clues throughout our marriage: his phone that he'd guarded carefully, his unexplained absences, his reluctance to have children earlier in our marriage when my fertility would have been better, his sudden enthusiasm for surrogacy specifically. I'd dismissed all of it because I'd loved him and trusted him. Dr. Chen said that's what victims do. We trust people we love. That's normal. What wasn't normal was Derek's exploitation of that trust. She said I needed to stop blaming myself for not seeing through his lies sooner. She said the person responsible for deception is always the deceiver, not the deceived. It took months to internalize that truth. I'd spent so long thinking I should have known better. But Derek had been playing a long game. He'd been lying since before we'd met. I'd never had a chance to know the real person I'd married because Derek had never shown me who he really was. 2 years after the divorce, I felt ready to consider dating again. My sister convinced me to join an app. I was reluctant but lonely. I missed partnership even though I didn't miss Derek. I went on mediocre dates with men who talked about themselves for hours. I went on awkward dates where conversation died within minutes. I almost quit entirely before I matched with Elijah. His profile was simple. He was a software engineer who loved hiking and cooking. He had a daughter from a previous marriage. His photos showed him genuinely smiling, not the posed corporate shots many profiles featured. We messaged for a week before meeting. He was thoughtful in his questions and funny in his observations. When we finally met for coffee, I knew within minutes he was different from the other dates. He actually listened when I spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He was interested in me as a person, not just as a potential relationship. We took things slowly. Elijah had been through a painful divorce too. His ex-wife had cheated with his best friend. He understood betrayal. We spent months just talking, sharing our histories carefully. When I finally told him about Derek and the surrogacy fraud, Elijah held my hand and said he was sorry I'd been through that. He didn't minimize it or compare it to his own experience. He just witnessed my pain. He met my family and they loved him immediately. My sister said he was the anti-Derek in every way. Honest, kind, secure. I met his daughter Piper when we'd been dating 6 months. She was 8 years old and brilliant and immediately asked if I could help with her science project on volcanoes. She didn't have her mother in her life regularly anymore. Her mother had moved to a different state and saw Piper rarely. Piper was wary of me at first but warmed up when she realized I wasn't trying to replace her mother. Elijah and I talked honestly about children a year into our relationship. I told him I couldn't carry a pregnancy safely. He said he'd always wanted more kids but would only pursue it if I was comfortable. We discussed adoption and legitimate surrogacy. The idea of surrogacy terrified me after what Derek had done, but Elijah said we could research agencies together and interview multiple surrogates. He said we'd only proceed if I felt completely safe. We spent 6 months researching before selecting an agency called Pacific Surrogacy Services. They were a well-established agency with decades of experience and hundreds of successful surrogacies. They had extensive vetting processes, psychological evaluations for surrogates, and clear legal protocols. We interviewed 5 surrogates before meeting Gabriella. She was 32 and had carried 3 successful surrogate pregnancies for other families. She had her own 2 children, and her husband fully supported her work as a surrogate. Gabriella was warm but professional. She explained that she'd become a surrogate after her sister had struggled with infertility. She'd seen the pain of wanting children and not being able to carry them. She'd discovered she loved pregnancy and had easy, healthy pregnancies. She wanted to help families who couldn't experience pregnancy themselves. We asked about her previous surrogacies, and she provided references. We called the families, and they all spoke glowingly about Gabriella. She'd been supportive and communicative throughout. She'd respected boundaries and had remained friends with all the families in appropriate ways. We asked Gabriella why she wanted to work with us specifically. She said she'd read our family profile and had been moved by my story of infertility and loss. She said Elijah's dedication to his daughter showed he'd be a wonderful father to another child. She said she'd be honored to help us. Unlike Sloane's rehearsed responses, Gabriella's words felt genuine. We used my eggs and Elijah's sperm for the IVF procedure. The embryo transfer happened on a rainy November morning. Gabriella invited us to be present. We held her hands during the procedure and cried when the doctor confirmed the embryo had been successfully transferred. We waited 2 weeks for the pregnancy test, the longest 2 weeks of my life. When the call came confirming Gabriella was pregnant, Elijah and I held each other and sobbed with joy and relief. This pregnancy was real and honest. No fraud, no deception. Just a generous woman helping us create our family. Gabriella sent us weekly updates with photos of her growing belly. She invited us to every prenatal appointment. We heard the heartbeat together. We saw ultrasounds showing our daughter developing healthy and strong. Gabriella never overstepped boundaries or tried to insert herself into our family beyond her role as surrogate. She was carrying our child, and she respected that distinction completely. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated. Gabriella took excellent care of herself. She followed all medical recommendations. She sent us photos of her eating well and walking daily for exercise. She texted funny observations about pregnancy cravings and fatigue. She included us in every aspect without making demands. When complications arose at 36 weeks with Gabriella's blood pressure, she immediately notified us. We rushed to the hospital and stayed with her through monitoring. The doctors recommended early delivery for safety. Gabriella was calm throughout. She said our daughter's health was the priority. Labor was induced, and 12 hours later, our daughter was born. The moment the doctor placed her on my chest, I understood what I'd been missing. This was real love, not born from deception, but from choice and honesty. We named her Iris Rose. She had Elijah's dark hair and my green eyes and a cry that was beautifully, perfectly loud. Gabriella held Iris for a few moments before the birth, whispering something we couldn't hear. Then she placed her in my arms and said congratulations with tears streaming down her face. She said she was honored to have helped bring Iris into the world. Over the next few months, Gabriella sent occasional texts checking on Iris and sharing that she was recovered and doing well. She never asked for more involvement than we were comfortable with. She respected our family completely. We sent her photos and updates periodically. The relationship was healthy and clear. Gabriella had been our surrogate. She was part of Iris's story. But she wasn't trying to be her mother. I was Iris's mother in every way that mattered. Derek had tried to use surrogacy as a weapon to trick me. Instead, legitimate surrogacy had given me the family I'd always wanted. 3 years after Iris was born, Elijah and I were married in a small ceremony surrounded by family. Piper was my maid of honor, 11 years old and beaming. Iris was our flower girl, toddling down the aisle throwing petals. My sister cried through the entire ceremony. My mother said she'd never seen me happier. She was right. I'd spent years with Derek feeling like I was failing at the one thing I wanted most, a family. He'd made me feel broken and desperate. He'd used that desperation to nearly destroy me completely. But I'd survived. I'd escaped. I'd built a real life with a partner who was honest and kind. Elijah and I talked about whether to tell Iris about Derek someday. We decided we'd be honest when she was old enough to understand. She'd know that families come in many forms. She'd know that sometimes people hurt each other badly, but healing is possible. She'd know she was wanted and chosen and loved from the moment we'd decided to bring her into the world. Derek's life continued its downward spiral based on updates I received occasionally from mutual acquaintances. He'd lost his job and had struggled to find new employment in the tech industry. His reputation was too damaged. He'd moved back to his hometown in Minnesota and was working in IT support at a small company. He was paying child support for Aubrey and Evan, but his income was a fraction of what it had been. He could only afford minimal visitation. His relationship with Sloan remained toxic. They communicated only through lawyers and a custody app. Aubrey was now 9 years old and in therapy for attachment issues. Evan was 5 and barely knew Derek existed. The elaborate scheme Derek had constructed to have everything had left him with nothing meaningful. No career, no family, no future prospects. His parents had grown tired of his drama and had distanced themselves. His friends had abandoned him after learning what he'd done. He'd destroyed every relationship in pursuit of a fantasy where he could maintain multiple lives simultaneously. I received a message from Sloan 4 years after the divorce. She'd found me through social media and wanted to apologize. She said she'd been in therapy and had realized the depth of her mistakes. She said she'd been blinded by her feelings for Derek and had made terrible choices. She said her children were growing up knowing their father was unreliable and dishonest. She said watching Aubrey struggle with abandonment issues had shown her how selfish she'd been. She said she regretted getting involved in Derek's scheme and wished she'd been honest from the beginning. She said she hoped I'd found happiness and that Iris was healthy. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. The message felt genuine but also too late. Some apologies come after damage that can't be repaired. I didn't respond. Forgiving Sloan wouldn't change what she'd done. She'd actively participated in Derek's deception. She'd laughed at my pain in those text messages the private investigator had found. She'd been willing to watch me raise her baby believing it was mine through surrogacy. Her regret now didn't undo the trauma or the betrayal. I blocked her and moved forward. Elijah and I discussed whether to pursue another surrogacy for a second child. We decided to wait a few years and see how we felt. Piper was now 14 and navigating high school. Iris was 4 and full of energy and questions. Our family felt complete, but we left the door open for future possibilities. We'd learned that plans could change and that flexibility was important. What mattered was honoring each other's feelings and making decisions together honestly. Derek had made every decision unilaterally, and then manipulated me into accepting his choices. Elijah consulted me on everything, from what we'd have for dinner to major financial decisions. He valued my opinion and treated me as an equal partner. The contrast with Derek was stark. I hadn't realized how little power I'd had in my first marriage until I experienced a healthy partnership. 5 years after the divorce, my life bore no resemblance to what it had been with Derek. I had a career I loved, working as a project manager at a nonprofit. I had Elijah and our blended family. I had my own money and independence. I had friends who genuinely cared about me, not just people who tolerated me because I was Derek's wife. I had Iris who called me mama and ran to me when she was scared or happy or needed comfort. I dreamed of being a mother for so long while Derek had sabotaged that dream at every turn. Now I was a mother to Iris and a stepmother to Piper. Both girls knew they were loved completely. Derek had wanted to exploit my infertility to create a false family built on lies. Instead, his betrayal had freed me to build a real family built on trust. The irony wasn't lost on me. His worst act had led to my best life. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.